Hey guys, tonight we walk into a quiet Grecian winter, one where the ground crunches softly beneath your sandals, olive branches hold still in the cold air, and every field feels like it's holding its breath. You're stepping into the part of the myth where Demeter, goddess of grain and growth, leans into her quieter side. And honestly, the way she stares across these frozen plains, it feels like she's silently judging your productivity levels. Which is fair. Anyone who's ever skipped laundry for 3 days should probably fear a goddess who controls the entire agricultural cycle. Before we go any further, let's just get this out of the way. If Demeter were here right now and saw you wandering into her fields at dawn wearing socks that don't match, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not because she'd smite you more, because you'd slip in the frost and embarrass yourself into oblivion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air around you feels ancient, cold enough to nip your nose, yet soft enough to coax your shoulders down. You walk along a narrow dirt path, dusted with winter frost. The fields on both sides stretch outward like wide pages of an unwritten book. Nothing is growing, nothing is sprouting, and nothing is demanding anything from anyone. This is Demeter's quiet season, the months where the world rests, and she watches over stillness instead of abundance. There's something strangely comforting about how empty the fields are. No buzzing insects, no shouting farmers, no stomping oxen ploughing long furrows. Just breath and sky. You've stepped into the side of myth, people. Forget the part where Demeter appreciates silence more than barley. She doesn't need things to be blooming. Sometimes she needs them to sleep. A soft breeze pushes across the plain, stirring the dry stalks that remain from last harvest. You catch yourself listening for something: footsteps, voices, a divine whisper, but all you get is the winter hush. Even the birds decide to stay quiet, as if they signed a confidentiality agreement with the goddess. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. In many regions of ancient Greece, winter wasn't just an off-season, it was a sacred pause. Farmers believed that disturbing the land too early could offend Demeter, who needed time to heal the soil and prepare it for spring. You glance down at the ground beneath you. It does feel like the earth is sleeping deeply. As you walk, you notice faint offerings tucked along the path, little clumps of grain, woven straw tokens, or simple pine branches laid neatly at the field's edge. Nothing fancy, just small gestures. A quirky little tidbit pops up. Some rural Greeks believed that leaving a few kernels of last season's barley out during winter gave Demeter something to snack on when she wandered the fields. Divine midnight snacking. Relatable. Honestly, you pull your cloak tighter as a light frost sparkles across the horizon. Even without seeing her, you feel Demeter's presence, a quiet, heavy calm that settles over the land like a wool blanket. She isn't angry, but she is solemn. Winter, for her, is a season of thought, of remembering Persephone's departure, of grieving without collapsing, of letting the world slow down enough to match her heartbeat. You step farther into the field, your breath turning to soft clouds. Frost crunches beneath you. A patch of tall, dry reeds shifts with a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, the faint beat of a ceremonial drum echoes from a village preparing for a quiet ritual in her honor. One meant not to celebrate harvest, but to honor rest. Historians still argue whether these winter months were viewed as Demeter's sorrow or her sanctuary. Some say she spent them grieving Persephone's absence. Others claim she cherished the stillness, treating winter as a sacred cocoon where the world regained its strength. Following her energy in this moment, you're starting to think both might be true. You keep walking until you reach a gentle rise in the field. From here, the land stretches out endlessly, pale gold beneath the icy dawn. You can almost imagine Demeter standing here, arms folded, scanning the sleeping earth, the way a mother peeks into a resting child's room, not to wake it, just to feel reassured. It hits you slowly. This quiet landscape isn't empty. It's intentional. A long inhale before the year exhales again. You touch a frozen stalk of wheat and feel the cold travel up your fingertips. The world might be silent, but something in your chest is settling, loosening. Maybe resting fields aren't just important for crops. Maybe they're important for people too, because as you breathe in the chill air, you feel it. Demeter loves winter, not for what it lacks, but for what it offers. Room to remember, room to heal, room to wait. And with that realization warming you from the inside, the path ahead brightens gently beneath the rising winter sun. You continue down the frost-laden path, your footsteps carrying you deeper into the fields that Demeter favors during these quiet months. The winter sun climbs a little higher, though you swear it's doing the bare minimum, like a celestial co-worker who shows up to the meeting but keeps their camera off. The cold settles gently over everything, but instead of feeling harsh, it feels deliberate, almost curated, a mood board made by a goddess who prefers silence over spectacle. Ahead of you, the fields widen and flatten until the horizon blends seamlessly with the pale sky. You sense movement, not fast or dramatic, but soft, like the land stretching under a heavy quilt. And then you feel it again, that presence, calm, watchful, patient in a way humans rarely are. Demeter walks somewhere just out of sight, but you feel her with you, not in a horror movie, something breathing down your neck way, but more like the comforting weight of someone who knows the land better than you know your own browsing history. You pause by a cluster of frost-coated thistles. They stand stiff and stubborn, refusing to bend to winter's authority. Demeter would approve of their attitude. She has always had a soft spot for anything that persists quietly. You brush one with your glove, and tiny crystals scatter like powdered stars. A mainstream historical fact surfaces from your memory. In many Greek regions, winter wasn't depicted as a dead season, but as the earth's sacred sleep. Farmers believed the soil needed stillness to regain its strength, just like Demeter needed time to gather herself between Persephone's departures and returns. Winter wasn't a punishment, it was a reset button. You keep walking, and the cold deepens, but it doesn't feel unfriendly, just honest. Winter doesn't lie. It shows you exactly what's alive, what's resting, and what needs letting go. Summer is theatrical. Winter is sincere. Along the path, you notice faint footprints, some human, some animal, and some that look suspiciously like they belong to someone who doesn't bother making impressions at all. You trail behind them, feeling oddly like a mortal in a divine bring-your-human-to-work day. Demeter has been here recently. The earth reacts to her differently, not loudly, not dramatically, but reverently. You reach a small hillock, a kind of natural overlook where you can see farther than before. Demeter stands at the crest, not in a blaze of golden light, but wrapped in muted greens and soft browns, blending into the winter palette, the way a shepherd blends into a flock. She looks over the fields with an expression both tender and tired. The sight of her almost knocks the breath out of you, not because she's terrifying, but because she radiates the kind of calm you've been trying to fake for most of your adult life. She doesn't speak, she simply walks along the ridge, trailing her fingers through dry, sleeping grass. Each touch is a check-in, a quiet whisper. Rest, rest, rest. You follow at a respectful distance, hoping she doesn't suddenly decide humans need to be pruned like overgrown shrubs. Thankfully, she seems too preoccupied with the land to worry about your questionable winter outfit choices. A quirky tidbit slips into your thoughts. Ancient poets wrote that Demeter preferred winter mornings because the earth listens better when cold. Was this metaphor a cultural joke, a divine performance review? Hard to say, but as you watch her glide across the frost, you could believe it. Everything here seems to be holding its breath in her presence. You crunch across a patch of frozen soil, and Demeter stops. Slowly, she turns her head, not all the way, just enough to glance at you over her shoulder. It's not a glare, more like a reminder that winter isn't an invitation to stomp around like a toddler wearing rain boots. You freeze, mid-step, apologizing with your entire soul. She resumes her walk, and you tread more lightly. The stillness around you begins to make sense. This isn't Demeter grieving not today. This is Demeter inspecting, observing, making sure her fields are sleeping the way they're meant to. Winter is her audit season. You watch her kneel beside a patch of bare earth, She presses her palm down and closes her eyes. You try it too, placing your glove against the soil. It's cold, obviously, but beneath the surface, you feel something else. A faint firmness, like the land is bracing itself, storing energy, waiting quietly. You pull back your hand and exhale, a small fog cloud forming in the air. Historians still argue whether Demeter's winter routines were imagined as literal divine actions or metaphorical agricultural lessons wrapped in myth. Were ancient farmers describing a goddess at work, or describing their own winter practices in divine language? Watching her now, testing the ground, studying the horizon, you understand why the debate hasn't resolved. In stories like this, science and spirit blur together. You and Demeter continue walking. Occasionally, she pauses to check on a sleeping olive grove, or examine the skeletal remains of last season's wheat. Sometimes, she hums a low, barely there vibration that seems to seep into the soil. The earth responds with quiet heat, as if leaning into her warmth. You can't help noticing how peaceful she looks. Not happy in a fireworks way, more like someone who finally has a quiet house after hosting a very loud, very long family reunion. At one point, she stops at a dried stream bed, running her fingers gently along its frozen curve. Even water rests in winter. Everything does. And maybe that's why Demeter loves these fields so deeply. No demands, no constant growth, no frantic harvest deadlines, just breathing room. You step beside her, still keeping respectful space between mortal and goddess. For a moment, she lets her hand rest on the cold earth, and you feel it too, the pulse of a season designed for stillness. Demeter rises, brushes frost from her fingers, and looks across the plain. The faintest smile appears, a small, tired, knowing smile. Winter isn't a void for her. It's a sanctuary, a rare moment when the world matches her heart's quiet rhythm. And as she moves forward again, you follow, feeling the land settle beneath the soft weight of the goddess who watches over its sleep. You walk a little farther down the winter field, and the light shifts again. Not brighter, not darker, just emptier. Like someone quietly removed a layer of warmth you didn't realize the morning had been carrying. The air settles around you with a new kind of stillness, one that feels gentler but also oddly hollow, like a room where a candle has just been blown out. You pull your cloak a little tighter, wondering if this sudden shiver is from the cold or from the soft ache that seems woven through the land. You don't have to be a mythologist to understand what's happening. Even without seeing her, you feel the absence of Persephone like a missing note in a chord, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it, but obvious once you're listening closely. Demeter walks ahead, and though she moves with the same careful grace as before, something in her posture has shifted. Her shoulders slope just slightly, not with devastation, but with a heaviness you recognize instantly, the heaviness of someone keeping busy so their heart doesn't sink too low. The earth feels it too. The soil no longer hums with the faint warmth you sensed earlier. Instead, it lies quiet, resting, maybe even sighing a little. Winter in these fields isn't a season of despair. It's a season of longing, a season built around someone missing. You step over a frozen furrow and watch your breath drift into the air like a small, stubborn cloud. Demeter pauses by a patch of winter-bare almond trees, their branches thin and skeletal against the pale sky. She touches a branch lightly, brushing frost from it the way you might brush snow from a friend's shoulder. A mainstream historical fact floats up. In ancient Greece, the changing of the seasons wasn't simply climate. It was mythology woven into agriculture. Persephone's descent meant dormancy. Her return meant bloom. Farmers planted, harvested, and prayed according to the timing of a daughter leaving and coming home. Winter was Demeter's quiet grief written across the fields. You watch her linger under the almond tree. Her expression softens, and for a moment she closes her eyes, breathing in the cold air as if tasting memories. You probably should give her a moment, but you also don't want to wander off and get lost in a divine winter landscape. Not an ideal way to go viral. So you wait. The silence around you feels different now. Not empty, but full of things unsaid. The ground under your boots holds the memory of Persephone's, footsteps from seasons past. You feel it like a soft echo beneath the frost, a warmth that once lived here and promises to return. You continue walking, and the sky above shifts into a muted silver. A flock of winter crows crosses overhead, their wings slicing quietly through the cold. Demeter follows their path with her eyes. She doesn't smile, but there's a familiar fondness there. Birds have always been messengers for the gods, and if anyone has a reason to appreciate messages from afar, it's her. A quirky tidbit nudges your thoughts. Ancient storytellers sometimes claimed winter existed because Persephone forgot time entirely in the underworld, chatting endlessly with shades and spirits. Imagine the entire agricultural cycle hinging on supernatural small talk, divine ADHD, but make it seasonal. You try not to laugh out loud, because laughing alone in a field near a goddess feels like a fast way to get turned into a shrub. Demeter moves again, and you trail behind her through a small hollow where frost glitters on every blade of dormant grass. She bends and touches the ground with tender familiarity. You mimic her, placing your hand gently on the cold soil. It's colder here, noticeably so, and a little harder. Not dead, just waiting. Winter isn't absence, it's anticipation. You look up and realize Demeter is watching you, not with suspicion, but with the kind of expression adults give children when they try something earnest and slightly clumsy. Her eyes soften, and she nods, as if encouraging your attempt to understand the land the way she does. You inhale slowly. The air is crisp, edged with the faint scent of pine resin drifting in from the forest nearby. The cold bites at your nose, but it's a clean, quiet bite, almost refreshing. The earth exudes a chilly patience. You begin to understand why Demeter chooses to walk these fields during loneliness, because here, even silence feels alive. You crest a gentle rise and spot something unexpected. A patch of winter crocuses, tiny purple sparks pushing through frost. Demeter kneels beside them, brushing snow aside to better see their petals. They are Persephones, flowers, symbols of her return. Seeing them now feels like catching a glimpse of a dream arriving early. You crouch beside Demeter, keeping your distance but close enough to see the way her fingers hover just above the petals, not touching, as if afraid the fragile blooms might vanish under her hand. There's a quiet yearning in the way she looks at them, a longing for someone whose absence shapes the very rhythm of the world. Historians still argue whether these myths were meant to explain seasonal cycles or express emotional truths about mothers and daughters, separation and reunion. Watching Demeter here, her presence solid and strong, yet shadowed by a single missing thread, you start to think both interpretations are true. The land reflects her heart, and her heart reflects the land. You rise slowly and follow her as she resumes her walk across the fields. The winter light drapes around her like a pale shawl, softening the edges of her silhouette. You can almost imagine the moment Persephone returns, how the ground will warm, how buds will unfurl, how Demeter's footsteps will lighten. But for now, winter remains a sanctuary built around her longing, a quiet season shaped by absence, but not defined by sorrow. You walk beside her, feeling the weight of the earth settling into its winter breath, steady, slow, patient. Demeter pauses one last time on a small rise and looks across her quiet kingdom. The fields stretch endlessly, soft and silver, waiting gently for the warmth they know will someday return. And with the goddess at your side, you feel the beauty of that waiting too. You follow Demeter's quiet steps as she drifts deeper into the winter countryside, the sound of your own feet muffled against frost-packed soil. The fields around you feel wider now, long, pale ribbons of earth, stretching straight toward the low horizon. The air is sharper too, the kind that makes your eyelashes feel like they're wearing tiny ice helmets. And yet Demeter walks as though this chill were silk. She tilts her head slightly, reading the land the way a seasoned librarian reads a shelf, for gaps, for order, for the whispers a casual visitor would completely miss. The ground under the thin frost tells her things. You can almost sense it yourself if you pause long enough. Beneath the cold crust, the soil is settling, quieting itself after months of summer heat and autumn harvest. A mainstream historical fact floats to mind. The Greeks genuinely believed wintry dormancy was not death, but a sacred pause, an intentional stilling of the earth, while Demeter withdrew her warmth. Crops weren't just sleeping, they were following a divine rhythm, shifting into a phase of inward gathering. Farmers of the era, actually timed their calendars around this silent season, trusting it the same way sailors trusted the moon. You breathe in slowly. The air smells faintly like dried grass and stone, a kind of clean that feels older than history. Demeter brushes her fingers along a withered stalk, still standing in the field. The plant, stubborn and tiny, rattles lightly in the breeze. For a moment, her expression softens, as if she's greeting an old friend who stayed behind long after everyone else went home. Winter fields, in her mind, weren't empty. They were honest. Summer fields perform. They shout with color and demand attention from bees, birds, people, and gods. Winter fields whisper. They pull back the curtain of noise and lay bare the bones of the land, the ridges, the shadows, the curves that normally hide beneath thick layers of life. There's a quirky little tidbit scholars like to mention. Ancient Greek farmers sometimes walked their fields at night during winter, believing Demeter herself roamed them in the dark. They'd say the frost glittered where her footsteps passed. Was it superstition? Poetry? A small attempt to explain why winter silence felt so strangely comforting? Possibly all three. You watch Demeter as she pauses and turns her palm upward, letting the pale sunlight spill across her skin. The light feels faint, thin as a sigh, and yet she closes her eyes like it's enough. She moves again, and you follow. The field slopes gently upward, giving you a view of distant olive groves stripped to their winter outlines. The trees look skeletal, but not unhappy, more like they're resting after months of producing fruit that merchants will swear is the best in the region for the next 600 years. The branches stand rigid in the cool air. No rustling, no gossip, just stillness. Demeter gestures for you to kneel. You crouch down beside her as she presses a hand to the earth. You copy her, and immediately the chill sinks into your palm. Strangely grounding, strangely steady. You both stay like that a moment. No words, just contact with the ground. Finally, she lifts her hand, wipes a bit of frost onto her cloak, and continues. You stand and trail behind her, your footsteps soft. Your breath puffs into small clouds that fade quickly into the morning air. In the distance, you see a pair of farmers walking the perimeter of their land, checking for broken fences or animal tracks. They move slowly, as though winter enforces a kind of gentle patience on all who pass through it. They nod respectfully toward Demeter, even though they can't see her. They sense something like the subtle pressure shift before a weather change. As you head farther into the field, Demeter stops again, at a patch of soil where nothing grows. Not weeds, not oats, not barley. Just an open square of bare ground, darker than the frost around it. She kneels again, sweeping her fingers lightly across its surface. She seems to be absorbing something you can't yet detect. When she finally rises, her face carries a quiet expression of satisfaction. Balance, she seems to say without words. You realize suddenly that winter is her reset button, her way of smoothing out the cluttered chaos of seasons, of letting the earth breathe deeply and slowly, a moment of stillness before the next surge of life. But of course, scholars still argue whether Demeter herself was understood as the architect of winter dormancy, or merely a guardian who withdrew her power during Persephone's absence. Some say she created winter, intentionally to mourn. Others say winter happened naturally, and people gave meaning to it by tying it to her myth. Standing here beside her, watching her read the quiet fields like scripture, you suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle. Or perhaps the debate misses the point entirely. Winter feels like Demeter's season because she inhabits it with such familiarity. You move through the field with her, past rows of stubbled stumps sticking out of the soil like tiny reminders of last season's abundance. They look almost humorous, awkward, uneven, and you can't help thinking they're the vegetable kingdom's version of bedhead. It's comforting, somehow, to see the land in an imperfect state. No pressure to be lush or productive, just allowed to be. Demeter points at a faint track, running through the frost, made by some small animal earlier in the morning. Perhaps a hare, perhaps a fox. The track curves lazily, making no attempt at a straight line. She smiles faintly at it, and you get the sense that winter gives her a rare moment where she can enjoy the smaller, quieter details, the ones that get swallowed up in the noise of growing seasons. A breeze sweeps across the field, long, low, unhurried. Demeter lifts her face to it. You do the same. The air is dry but not harsh, cool but not punishing, just enough to remind you you're alive. You start to notice something. Winter isn't empty. Winter is full of pause, full of waiting, full of unspoken potential. Like a long inhale the world hasn't yet exhaled. And Demeter, she loves the inhale, the patience, the quiet trust that the world will bloom again when it's ready. Her cloak flutters slightly as she walks deeper into the stillness. The frost crunches softly beneath your feet. The sun hangs low and unambitious in the sky. Winter fields might look barren, but beside Demeter, you finally see them for what they truly are. A promise, resting. You follow the goddess as the field stretches into a quiet, frost-bitten distance, ribbons of pale winter light sliding across mud, stubble, and stone. At first, you assume she's slowing down because the terrain is uneven. Your boots are absolutely not built for this kind of pastoral cardio. But no, she slows because she's listening. And somehow, so are you. The air in a winter field is different from every other kind of silence. It holds its breath. It pauses between heartbeats. Even the birds keep their conversations to a minimum, as though gossip is strictly a springtime hobby. You inhale, expecting the crisp cold to sting your nose, but the air is strangely soft, as if someone turned down the world's volume knob and forgot to turn it back up again. Demeter kneels beside a brittle stalk of barley left from the harvest. She touches it gently, like greeting an old friend who survived a long night. You crouch beside her, a little less gracefully, because your knees have opinions about the temperature. She gestures with 2 fingers. Watch. The stalk bends ever so slightly in the faintest breeze, and you think, okay, it's a plant doing plant things. But then you realize she isn't watching the plant. She's watching the shadow the plant casts thin, trembling, stretched across the pale soil. The shadow moves differently than the wind that touches your face. It hints at something deeper, something that has nothing to do with weather apps or meteorological charts. A gentle truth slips into your thoughts. In the ancient world, winter fields weren't dead. They were resting, and rest has its own language. A mainstream historical fact flickers quietly into the moment. Farmers from Greece to Anatolia believed winter fields held a sacred stillness that protected seeds sleeping beneath the soil. They didn't see these months as empty. They saw them as holy, an interval where the earth gathered strength for spring. Demeter stands and begins walking slowly in a wide arc. And, like the loyal sidekick the narrator has now doomed you to be, you follow. Your footsteps crunch softly across frost. Every sound seems magnified, as though the field is repeating your steps back to you. You pause when she pauses. You breathe when she breathes. You pretend your toes are not already filing HR complaints. Then, Demeter lowers herself beside a patch of earth that seems no different from the rest. She presses her palm flat against the soil. Quiet expectation fills the air. You reluctantly try the same, though you're about 93% sure your hand is about to freeze to the ground and become an archaeological artifact. The soil is cold, but not lifeless. There's a hum, subtle as a distant heartbeat. You almost pull your hand back, startled, but Demeter shakes her head gently. Stay, feel, listen. So you do. And there it is, a faint warmth lingering deeper down, left over from autumn. It's like the earth is tucking the heat away for safekeeping, storing it beneath layers of silence. It's one of those magical moments that reminds you nature doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers in thermal gradients. Then comes the quirky tidbit, sneaking into your awareness. Some ancient farmers believed winter fields were guarded by small, unseen spirits, miniature caretakers who swept frost from seeds or lulled the soil into deeper rest. Tiny agricultural babysitters. You glance around in case one pops out to ask whether you've eaten today. Demeter rises again, brushing soil from her hand, and begins walking toward a lone olive tree, standing crooked near the edge of the field. She touches its trunk and looks up into its bare branches. You follow her gaze, half expecting some winter bird of prophecy to swoop down and judge your posture. Instead, the sky shifts. A thin band of clouds drifts low and slow, changing the light over the field, tilting shadows, cooling the air. Demeter watches the change with calm understanding, but you, being the mortal mess that you are, immediately assume the weather is staging a dramatic entrance with ominous sound effects. But nothing happens. No storm. No sudden chill. Just adjustment. And then the scholarly debate portion of your bedtime routine arrives. Historians still argue whether Demeter's winter wanderings were imagined as literal journeys across rural Greece, or symbolic metaphors for seasonal agricultural rest. Honestly, you can see it both ways. Right now, leaning into that quiet field with numb fingers and a goddess who communicates largely through eyebrow movements, symbolism feels pretty real. Demeter turns to you again and points toward the far end of the field, where thin patches of snow cling to the roots of dormant plants. She walks slowly, pacing herself with the deliberate rhythm of someone who respects the land too much to rush across it. You trot behind her, trying to imitate the calm, grounded stride, but mostly looking like someone chasing a bus they're embarrassed to admit they still need. She stops before a shallow furrow, old plough lines softened by frost. She kneels and traces one line with her fingertip. Her expression softens, and she murmurs, almost too quiet to hear, that winter is when the land heals, when the pressure of human hands lifts, when the earth breathes freely again. You close your eyes for a moment. You can almost feel it, the land resting exactly the way your brain wishes it could, after scrolling social media past midnight. The silence deepens, time stretches, your heartbeat slows in sync with the winter earth. And without meaning to, you understand why Demeter loved this season. Not for the cold, not for the emptiness, but for the peace that only a resting world can offer. The wind shifts again, softer this time, as though approving your revelation. You open your eyes, exhale a cloud of warm breath into the quiet morning, and continue walking beside the goddess into the waiting field. Demeter leads you toward the far edge of the winter field, where the dry golden stubble gives way to softer soil and patches of pale grass. The horizon brightens just enough for you to see a faint shimmer, almost like breath rising from the land itself. At first you think it's mist, or maybe your vision staging a minor rebellion after staring at frost for too long. But no, it's something else. A cluster of winter birds lifts from the distant olive grove quietly, without drama, like they're trying not to disturb the goddess walking nearby. Their wings cut soft arcs through the crisp air, and the sound is delicate, barely their flutters, that match the slow rhythm of Demeter's steps. You watch them glide, hover, turn, and you realize they aren't just wandering, they're following a pattern. Demeter stops, watching them with the calm of someone who already knows the answer to a question you haven't figured out how to ask. She lifts one hand, not to call them, but to indicate, look closely. So you squint like a confused falcon. One bird dips low over the field, then rises again, skimming the tops of frost-kissed grasses. Another circles the bare branches of a fig tree before returning to the group. The whole flock shifts direction in gentle sweeps, like slow breathing. You start counting them, then immediately lose track because bird math is apparently above your pay grade. A soft realization settles in your chest. These birds are telling her something. A mainstream historical fact glides into place. In ancient Greece, winter birds, especially thrushes and small cranes, were observed for subtle cues about soil temperature, moisture levels, and seasonal shifts. Farmers used them as unofficial consultants, the way modern people use weather apps that are only accurate half the time. One of the birds swoops lower than the others, wings barely brushing the cold air above the field. Demeter follows its path with serene concentration. You mimic her expression, but on you it looks more like someone trying to remember where they parked. Still, you try. You watch how the birds move, where they fly, how high or low they hover, and slowly, the pattern emerges. They're mapping the land, reading its temperature, tracing invisible lines across the field like feathered surveyors. A quirky tidbit floats into your thoughts. Some rural Greeks believed birds were messengers from Demeter herself, tiny feathered assistants who flew over fields to check on the earth's sleeping children. Basically, ancient agricultural drones, but softer and significantly more judgmental. The birds shift again, and Demeter nods as if approving their report. Then she starts walking once more, and you fall into step beside her through low, uneven terrain. The winter sun finally begins to rise, sending thin bands of gold across the land. Everything looks washed in pale honey, the color of softened wheat. Ahead, a lone crow stands on a fence post, silent, unmoving. It watches Demeter pass with a gravity that seems far too solemn for a creature that usually spends its day yelling at breadcrumbs. You pause to look at it, and it tilts its head, studying you like you're a particularly slow-moving puzzle. Demeter acknowledges it with a faint touch to her chest, a gesture of respect. You mimic her, but the crow only blinks at you, unimpressed. Typical. As you continue walking, the terrain changes again. You approach a small, shallow pond, mostly frozen, except for a thin ring of liquid water near the edges. A few birds peck gently at the ice, testing it. One hops onto the fragile surface and skids for a moment, flapping dramatically like it's auditioning for a winter comedy. You and Demeter watch in silence until the bird regains its dignified posture. She turns to you, and though she says nothing, her eyes seem to ask whether you understood the lesson, and you sort of do. The birds aren't just decorative. They are barometers, compasses, witnesses to the land's smallest changes. But then the scholarly debate moment tiptoes in, because no script of yours escapes it. Historians still argue whether ancient Greeks genuinely relied on birds for agricultural prophecy, or whether later writers exaggerated these practices into poetic symbolism. Honestly, watching Demeter track them like living weather reports, you're inclined to believe both sides. You move deeper into the field, following the subtle wing beats guiding your path. The birds scatter briefly, then regroup in a graceful formation before drifting toward the boundary where the winter field meets a small patch of woodland. Demeter raises a hand to stop you before you enter the trees. She crouches and brushes frost from the ground, revealing tracks thin, delicate imprints left by small winter creatures. Rabbits, maybe, or foxes, or those mythical field guardians you're only half convinced don't exist. The goddess traces the tracks with her fingertip, then looks again at the birds resting silently in the branches above. The whole scene feels like a quiet conference between land, air, and divine presence. You kneel beside her. The soil is cold. The air is still. The only movement is the occasional bird shifting its weight on a branch. And in that moment, you understand. The winter field speaks through tiny signs, feathers, shadows, tracks, breaths. You just have to slow down enough to hear them. Demeter stands, brushes frost from her hands, and walks on. The birds follow, some overhead, some at a distance, all part of a silent network of messengers. You breathe in the cold morning air and step after her, letting the quiet wisdom of winter settle into your bones. You follow Demeter toward the base of a gentle hill, where the ground begins to soften into longer, looser soil earth that holds stories like a patient librarian. The grasses here lie flat and pale, pressed down by nights of frost, but there's a kind of muted grace in the way they bend. Each blade seems to lean with quiet intention, as if pointing towards something you haven't noticed yet. Demeter slows her steps, letting you catch up. She tilts her head toward the hillside, inviting you to listen not with your ears, but with something deeper. You stand still. The winter air presses softly against your cheeks. At first, there's nothing but silence. Then, little by little, you hear it, a faint rhythm beneath your feet, subtle, steady, more felt than heard. You brace for something dramatic, an underground river, or the heartbeat of a giant mole god, but no, the answer is simpler. The hillside is catching wind, the slope redirects it, and the movement of air through sparse winter grass creates a low, breathy hum. Demeter touches the ground gently with her fingertips. You watch, fascinated. She isn't testing temperature or moisture this time. She's feeling vibration. The hillside is giving her information the way a tuning fork offers clues about a sound you can't hear. You kneel and place your hand beside hers. The ground is cool, firm, and humming. The vibration reminds you of distant music, like someone playing a flute 3 valleys over. It's oddly soothing, as if the hill is exhaling softly after holding its breath all night. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Ancient Greek farmers believed that hills and slopes could speak through wind patterns and ground vibrations, offering subtle hints about soil stability, moisture, and even upcoming weather. It wasn't mystical to them, it was basic observation stretched into intuitive wisdom. Demeter rises and begins walking upward, her steps light but sure. You follow, trying to imitate her calm pace and failing immediately. You crunch noisily through frost with the energy of someone stepping on bubble wrap. The goddess pauses near a cluster of rock outcrops. They look ordinary at first, just scattered stones, but as you draw closer, you see faint marks in the frost, tiny cracks, dust patterns, imprints of dried grass pinned beneath stone edges. Demeter sweeps her palm across one rock's surface, revealing a fine layer of icy dust that sparkles in the morning light. She lifts a single finger. Look closer. You lean in, really lean in. Too close. Your breath fogs the rock. What you see is subtle but real. The frost has melted unevenly. One side of the rock is slightly darker, warmer. The other side remains pale and icy. Demeter traces the divide with her fingertip, and suddenly the hillside feels like a giant compass. A quirky tidbit flutters into memory. Some Greeks believed Demeter placed sleeping markers on winter hills, rocks warmed gently by hidden thermal currents, used by shepherds to predict safe grazing routes. Not everyone agreed, and frankly, the rocks aren't talking. But the idea is charming. You rise from your crouch, brushing frost from your knees, like someone pretending they meant to kneel that long. Demeter points to the warmed side of the rock, and then gestures down the hill toward the quiet fields below. The subtle warmth means the winter wind hasn't settled evenly. The land is hiding little pockets of air, remnants of yesterday's sunlight stored beneath the soil surface. You try to look wise as you nod, but you're mostly thinking, so this rock is basically a seasonal thermostat? She starts walking again, and you follow her up the last stretch of slope until you reach the crest. The view that opens is wider than anything you've seen so far. Below you lie the sleeping fields, quiet, pale, soft-edged under the winter sun. They look like they're wrapped in a thin blanket of silver blue. Demeter's gaze settles on a small cluster of trees near the far edge. Their shadows stretch long, thin, and nearly identical. At first, you assume she's admiring symmetry, but then you realize she's reading them, analyzing how the angle of the winter sun interacts with land contours. She lifts her hand and traces an arc in the air, sunrise to now. You follow her gesture and notice how the shadows fall not in straight lines, but in subtly curved ones. The land dips in places you hadn't noticed, rises in others, and the trees reveal that shape better than the field itself. A scholarly debate drifts in like a polite guest. Historians still argue whether Greek farmers truly analyzed winter shadows for soil depth and slope, or whether that idea developed later through poetic retellings. Watching Demeter calculate landscape curvature through nothing but tree silhouettes, you suspect farmers may have learned more from winter sun than anyone gives them credit for. You and Demeter begin descending the opposite side of the hill. The air grows warmer with each step, shielded from the harsher winds above. Birds flutter through the lower branches of evergreen shrubs. A wisp of scent pine mixed with earth drifts past. You breathe it in deeply, grateful for something that doesn't smell like cold. At the base of the hill, Demeter stops again. She places a hand on the trunk of a small, nearly bare tree. Its bark is rough, layered, and slightly cracked. She presses her palm flat against it, then steps aside so you can do the same. The bark is warmer than you expect. Alive, steady, a quiet presence in the cold field. Trees hold heat in winter. Their roots keep the soil breathing. Their trunks act like slow-burning lanterns. Demeter smiles faintly. You understand the message. Even the smallest winter life tells the truth of the land. You just have to listen slower. The wind shifts gently through the branches, and the world feels softer again. Not silent, not empty, but full of quiet signals that only winter makes visible. You step back beside her as she continues walking deeper into the sleeping landscape. The winter hill behind you, humming its soft, lingering song. You follow Demeter into a lower stretch of the winter fields, where the frost has thinned into soft, glittering patches, each one catching the sunlight like ground-level constellations. The air here feels gentler, wrapped in a muted warmth that doesn't quite reach comfortable, but definitely reaches less freezing. You roll your shoulders, grateful. Even gods appreciate a valley with better insulation. Demeter slows again, not because she's tired, but because the landscape is speaking quietly and she wants you to hear it. She raises a hand toward the field ahead, where rows of harvested stalks stand like humble reminders of past abundance. They look like ribs of a sleeping giant, half buried but still marking time. You walk alongside her, boots crunching softly. Winter fields don't have much to show off. That's the point. But Demeter isn't looking for spectacle. She's looking for stillness. The kind of stillness that stores memory instead of emptiness. A mainstream historical fact drifts in. Ancient Greek farmers used winter to read the lands, fatigue how much each field had given, how much it could rest, and where next spring's efforts would begin. Winter wasn't downtime. It was diagnosis. Demeter crouches near a bare patch of soil and drags her fingers through the loose earth. You do the same. Your line looks like a toddler's doodle, hers like a signature the land understands. She lifts a pinch of soil, checking its crumble, its dryness, the faint stickiness that clings to her thumb. Without needing words, she tells you this field is healing properly. You nod, trying to pretend you understand. Really, you're thinking, cool dirt, soft dirt, maybe 8/10 dirt. Demeter stands and moves toward a narrow footpath that cuts through the field. It's not deep, just a smooth depression, worn by walkers, animals, and wind. She steps into it, following the path as if guided by old habit. You join her, realizing how much warmer these paths stay in winter. The soil is slightly darker, where footsteps compacted it through the years. A fringe tidbit pops into memory. Some ancient writers claimed Demeter herself created these warm footpaths during her wanderings, leaving behind lines of gentling heat that protected travelers from winter's bite. It's poetic, definitely questionable, but watching her walk this path makes the idea feel less like myth and more like a metaphor someone captured because it was too beautiful to lose. The path opens into a gentle dip in the landscape, a winter hollow. The air here is nearly still, pooled like water in a basin. You feel the temperature shift, rising just enough that your breath fogs less sharply. A few hardy winter weeds stand in clusters, their stems bending at odd, charming angles. They look like the botanical version of bedhead. Demeter picks one small dried stem and twirls it lightly between her fingers. The plant rattles a crisp, papery sound. She listens to it the way a jeweler listens to gemstones. The dryness tells her how long the frost has held, how deep the recent cold settled, and how slowly the soil beneath is waking. You try shaking one of the stems yourself. It rattles like a tiny maraca. Demeter gives you a patient smile. Okay, maybe you're not quite at winter weed diagnostic level yet. You continue walking through the hollow until she pauses again, this time raising her hand toward a cluster of distant oak trees. Their branches are bare but not brittle, stretched like dark veins against a pale sky. Their shadows fall long and straight across the field, forming lines so precise they look drawn with ruler and ink. But then you notice the subtle curves, the way the shadows bend around gentle rises, the way they shorten as the sun climbs. Demeter traces one shadow with her fingertip in the air. You follow her gesture, your eyes adjusting to the quiet detail. A subtle realization emerges. Winter is the only season where the land shows its true shape. No crops, no tall grass, no heat shimmer to blur edges, just contours, revealed honestly. Scholars still argue whether ancient Greeks officially mapped land by winter shadow, or whether farmers simply relied on intuition, habit, and light memory. But standing beside Demeter, watching her read shadow length like a calendar, you understand why winter was her season for reflection, not sorrow. You walk on until you reach a low stone boundary, barely a wall, more like a suggestion of one. The stones are uneven, moss sleeping in the cracks. Demeter kneels and presses her palm to the top stone. You do the same. It's warm, again warm. Not because of magic this time, but because the stone has absorbed the weak daylight and held onto it stubbornly. Ancient farmers used these stones the same way hikers use sun-warmed rocks now, as small, stubborn lifelines in cold months. Demeter taps two stones lightly, listening to the muted, hollow thuds. She's checking how much ice lies beneath them. A deeper, duller sound means the ground below is still frozen solid. A quicker, lighter sound means thawing has begun. The land keeps no secrets when you know how to knock. You imitate her, tapping a stone with your knuckle. It hurts. Demeter tries not to laugh. You pretend that was part of the scientific process. Together, you cross the stone boundary and return to a stretch of open field where frost has thinned so much it barely clings to the grass tips. The land looks like it's waking slowly, stretching the stiffness out of its sleep. The sun is higher now, filling the winter world with soft gold. Demeter stops once more, her gaze sweeping over everything you've walked through: the hums, the shadows, the warm stones, the quiet weeds. Winter, to her, isn't a pause. It's a confession. The land speaks most clearly when it's quiet, and she listens most deeply when the world is still. She turns to continue walking, and you follow, the winter field whispering beneath your steps like a book being gently turned page by page. You walk deeper into the quiet of the winter valley, the air now holding that particular stillness that only appears after the first true frost. The world feels muted, softened, as if someone lowered the volume on every sound except your footsteps crunching through the pale grass. Ahead, tucked between low hills, lies a small rural shrine, nothing lavish, nothing sculpted by master craftsmen, just a simple stone alcove, draped with dried reeds and little clay plaques, shaped by hands that probably had dirt under their nails. This is where Demeter receives winter offerings, quiet gestures from people who know life depends on things they cannot control. A shepherd arrives first. You hear him before you see him, boots knocking gently against the frozen ground. His flock grazes lazily behind him, steam rising from their wool in soft, sleepy clouds. He kneels at the shrine without ceremony and places a braid of hay carefully woven, surprisingly neat. He bows his head, not out of ritual precision but out of a tired gratitude. All his sheep survived the autumn. No wolves, no illness, a small victory disguised as everyday life. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Rural Greeks often left agricultural offerings outside of major festival seasons, especially in winter, when the harvest was over and people needed divine goodwill more than ever. These weren't grand sacrifices. They were little acknowledgements that survival was a collaboration between humans and gods. The shepherd steps back, touches the stone gently, as if patting an old friend, and moves on. A traveler approaches next. She looks cold, hungry, and slightly irritated by everything classic winter traveler energy. Her cloak is stiff with frost. A leather pouch dangles from her belt. She reaches inside and pulls out a handful of barley. Not much, probably all she can spare. She pours it slowly at the shrine's base, but then she does something unexpected. She places a small polished stone beside it. Oval, smooth, almost pretty. The fringed tidbit floats up. Some ancient communities believed Demeter liked memory stones, little tokens that represented the burdens or hopes someone was carrying. The idea was simple. Leave the stone, lighten the heart. You watch the woman straighten her back and exhale, like she genuinely feels lighter. You make a mental note to try this next time life becomes too much, and your to-do list looks like a tragic myth of its own. Soon after, a farmer trudges up the path, his boots covered in frozen mud. He carries what looks like a small clay pot. He sets it down in front of the shrine, removes the lid, and reveals dried figs arranged in a careful pattern, as if Demeter herself would grade the presentation. The man smiles shyly at his work. Maybe he practiced this arrangement at home. Maybe he's just relieved the figs didn't get eaten by the household kids. But the interesting part, he also leaves a broken piece of plough blade beside the pot. Historians still argue whether such metal fragments symbolized gratitude for tools that lasted through the season, or whether farmers left broken parts as a way of saying, "Please don't let this happen again." Judging by the farmer's weary expression, you suspect the latter. Nothing screams winter hardship like a tool you can't afford to replace. As the farmer walks away, you step closer. The offerings are humble: hay, barley, dried figs, stones, a chunk of broken iron. Not the kind of treasures you'd see in a rich temple, but each object is a tiny story about the person who placed it there. And Demeter, goddess of fields and patience, and the slow miracles of the earth, feels like exactly the kind of deity who would understand these quiet gestures. Snow begins to fall, just a few flakes at first, drifting lazily like they haven't yet decided whether they want to commit to the whole winter aesthetic. The world feels even more muted now, wrapped in white and hushed by cold. You watch a mother and her 2 children approach the shrine. The kids bounce more than walk, their breath fogging in little excited puffs. The mother carries a small basket, Inside are winter apples, shriveled, not pretty, but still scarlet against the pale air. She places them gently in front of the shrine, then nods for her children to add something. One child places a tiny bundle of dried lavender. The other carefully lays down a clumsy clay figure, shaped like, well, maybe it's a sheep or a potato. Hard to say, but the child looks proud, so it counts. The mother murmurs, a thank you, not a prayer, not a request, just gratitude. Winter is the season when gratitude matters most, because it's the season when survival is least guaranteed. You feel the subtle shift inside yourself again, that sense that Demeter's world isn't loud, isn't dramatic, isn't full of thunder and spectacle. It's made of these tiny, quiet exchanges, humans offering what little they can, and hoping that nature will return the kindness when spring comes. A gentle wind ripples through the bare reeds around the shrine. The flakes keep falling. The offerings sit patiently in the cold, like small promises whispered into the winter air. And as you stand beside the shrine, your breath mingling with the snow, you understand why Demeter loved quiet winter fields. They're where gratitude whispers instead of shouts, where offerings say more than speeches, where rest is not laziness, it's preparation. The goddess of harvest sees everything now, in the silence, in the stillness, in the soft human hope tucked carefully between winter's chill. You leave the little winter shrine behind and move farther into the countryside, where the land opens into a wide, pale expanse of sleeping fields. These are not the golden fields of summer or the bright green carpets of spring. They are muted, silvered, and still like the whole landscape is holding its breath. Frost glitters across the stubble of harvested grain, shimmering under weak daylight that barely seems awake. The silence here is thicker than anything you've felt before, almost velvety. Even your footsteps sound apologetic, as though you're disturbing a napping giant. This is where Demeter's heart truly rests in winter, not in temples, not in baskets of figs or vases of grain, but in these quiet, frost-covered squares of earth. You walk slowly between the fields, your breath curling in front of you, and you can almost sense an invisible presence beside you, patient, watchful, deeply protective. Winter is when the world looks empty, but Demeter sees it as full of possibility. Seeds sleep underground, roots gather strength, moisture settles into the soil, life rests so it can return. A mainstream historical fact rises softly in your mind. Ancient Greek farmers believed winter wasn't a dead season, but a sacred pause, when the earth restored itself. When Demeter withdrew, not in punishment, but in contemplation, winter was her long inhale before the exhale of spring planting. The frost crunches under your boots in slow, rhythmic steps. Far off, a thin ribbon of smoke rises from a farmhouse roof, someone cooking, someone waking up, someone noticing the cold and thinking, nope, not going outside unless truly necessary. You relate, deeply. A small flock of crows hops around the edge of a barley field, pecking for leftover grains. They look cold, but determined, like employees clocking in for a job they didn't fully agree to. One crow stares at you with judgmental intelligence before returning to its breakfast. A fringe tidbit surfaces. Some ancient farmers believed crows carried messages between Demeter and the sleeping fields, delivering warnings or blessings depending on how they flew. Helpful? Debatable. Dramatic? Absolutely. As you walk, a low fog begins creeping across the ground. Not the spooky horror movie fog, but a soft blanket that hugs the earth. It moves slowly, drifting around your knees like a cautious cat. The fog makes everything feel even quieter, more insulated, like the land has wrapped itself in a comforter. You feel your shoulders drop, tension slipping away. Winter does that. It narrows the world into calm, simple shapes. Demeter cherished that simplicity, the way the noise of harvest faded into a season of whisper-level rest. A farmer appears on the far edge of the field, leading a skinny donkey with a blanket strapped across its back. The man waves at you, one of those lazy winter waves that says, "My joints hurt, but I'm being friendly." He checks the soil with a wooden staff, breaking a thin layer of ice to inspect the earth beneath. He's not looking for anything dramatic, just making sure the soil holds moisture and hasn't dried out from too many cold winds. He nods, satisfied. As he walks away, you notice something tied to his belt, a tiny bag of seeds. Not for planting, not yet, but as a charm. Historians still argue whether winter seed charms were devotional tokens or practical reminders for the next season. But based on how carefully he touches the bag, you suspect it's a little of both, a small promise to Demeter that hell return to the fields when she calls. You step closer to one frozen plot, kneeling to touch the frost-laced dirt. It feels firm, almost brittle at the surface. But when you gently push deeper with your fingertips, the soil gives way softly. Beneath the cold crust, the earth is surprisingly warm, alive, resting, waiting, and the realization hits you gently. Winter isn't the absence of growth, it's the preparation for it. Somewhere in the distance, a lone windmill creaks, turning slowly in the winter breeze. The sound is comforting, not eerie, more like an old guardian pacing the boundary of the fields, making sure nothing disturbs their slumber. You imagine Demeter walking these same fields quietly, slowly, brushing her fingers across the frozen stalks, refusing to rush the seasons. There's wisdom in that stillness. Modern life could use more of it. You wander on, letting the cold settle into your clothes without rushing to escape it. There's a clarity to this kind of chill, a simple message the land keeps repeating. Slow down. Let things rest. Not every moment has to be productive. Even the gods took time to breathe. The fog grows thicker, wrapping you in a soft white embrace. You feel safe, oddly enough. Not lost, held, protected by the same stillness Demeter loved. Winter fields weren't threatening to her. They were home. A season where nothing demanded immediate attention, where nature wasn't screaming for work or harvest or frantic preparation. It was a season of trust. Trust that life continues beneath the surface. Trust that warmth returns. Trust that cycles matter more than moments. A gust of wind sweeps across the field, lifting powdered frost into the air like shimmering dust. The particles swirl briefly, catching pale light, then settle again in a long sigh. You watch them fall, mesmerized by the gentleness of it all. And as you stand, brushing frost from your gloves, you feel something settle in your chest, a kind of quiet understanding. You finally get it. Demeter didn't cherish winter fields because they were empty. She cherished them because they were healing, silent, patient, honest. And in that cold, muted landscape, you realize the same thing she did. Sometimes the world grows best when it learns how to rest. You leave the frost-glazed fields behind and follow a narrow dirt path that winds toward a quiet village tucked against the base of a low hill. Thin smoke curls from chimneys, drifting upward in lazy spirals, nothing like the vigorous harvest season fires you've seen before. These are winter hearth fires, small, steady, meant to warm but not waste, meant to glow but not raw. Even the smoke rises more gently, as if respecting the calm of the season. As you step into the village square, the world feels softer somehow. Footprints press lightly into the thin snow, doors creak open and shut in slow, careful movements, and a few villagers shuffle around wrapped in wool that looks one accidental sneeze away from unraveling. It's peaceful, quiet, exactly the kind of winter hush Demeter adored. You spot a cluster of people gathered near a tiny shrine on the eastern side of the square. It's barely larger than a cupboard, wooden, hand-painted, and topped with a straw roof dusted in snow, but the respect in the air around it makes it feel monumental. At the shrine's base sits a small offering tray, filled with winter gifts, dried figs, cracked walnuts, sprigs of rosemary, and little pouches of grain tied with red thread. A mainstream historical fact rises softly in your mind. Many ancient Greek villages held intimate winter rituals for Demeter. Nothing grand, nothing theatrical, just quiet acts of gratitude that acknowledged her role in sustaining life through the coldest months. Winter offerings weren't about abundance. They were about appreciation, patience, and trust. You move closer. A middle-aged woman leans forward, placing a round barley cake on the tray. She whispers something you can't quite hear, but her voice carries the softness of someone speaking to an old friend, rather than a distant goddess. Another villager lights a small clay lamp, shielding the flame from the wind with one hand. The lamp glows gently, a warm, humble reminder that even in winter, light persists. You watch the ritual unfold in slow, deliberate steps. No chanting, no dramatic gestures, just quiet devotion. You feel yourself relaxing into the rhythm of it, your breath sinking with the soft exhale of the winter air. There's something comforting about a ritual that doesn't demand performance, only presence. A little girl stands beside you, clutching a handful of dried rose petals. She sprinkles them around the shrine with intense concentration, making sure each petal lands exactly where she wants it. She looks up at you proudly, as if expecting applause. You give her a small nod of approval. She beams. A fringe tidbit slips into your mind. In some rural communities, children were told that Demeter loved winter rose petals because they reminded her of Persephone's laughter, an echo of spring tucked into the cold. Entirely sentimental, scientifically questionable, but adorable. Nearby, several villagers gather around a larger communal hearth. The fire is low but steady, giving off a warm amber glow that flickers across their faces. You join them, feeling the heat seep gratefully into your cold fingertips. The air smells like pine smoke, toasted grain, and the faint sweetness of winter herbs. Someone hands you a cup of warm barley tea. It tastes earthy, simple, honest, exactly the flavor winter should have. One man, wrapped in 3 layers of clothing that clearly each have their own emotional backstory, leans closer and mutters that the village always keeps the hearth fire burning through the longest winter nights, to remind Demeter she is never forgotten. He shrugs, as if embarrassed by the admission, but there's sincerity in his voice. Deep, steady sincerity. A woman tending the fire adds a pinch of dried mint to the flame. A tiny green spark flickers upward, releasing a fresh scent into the cold air. She tells you it helps carry good thoughts to the goddess, whether that's tradition, superstition, or just a nice-smelling habit. Well, historians still argue whether winter herbs in offerings had spiritual meaning or were simply whatever people had available. Either way, the scent is comforting, as the villagers share tea, bread, and occasional gossip, mostly about goats. You notice how the atmosphere shifts. Winter usually feels like a season of isolation, but here it becomes a season of gentle togetherness, quiet conversations, shared warmth, and simple rituals that require nothing but sincerity. The kind of season where you don't need big celebrations. You just need a place to sit, a fire to warm your hands, and people who understand the value of silence. A gust of wind sweeps across the square, rustling the shrine's straw roof and sending a few rose petals drifting into the air. Rather than panic about the offerings being disturbed, the villagers smile. Demeter likes movement. An elderly woman whispers. It means the world is listening. She presses a small wheat charm woven from 3 thin stalks into your hands. The charm is simple but beautiful, braided carefully and tied with a string dyed with leftover wine. She tells you it's meant to keep the heart warm during winter. You're not sure whether she means physically or emotionally, but you tuck it safely into your coat all the same. As dusk begins to gather, the hearth's glow becomes brighter against the darkening sky. Shadows stretch long across the snow, and the little shrine continues to flicker softly with its single clay lamp. A sense of peace settles over the village, a peacefulness so gentle it nearly feels sacred. You breathe in the quiet. You breathe in the warmth. You breathe in the soft rhythm of winter devotion, and for a moment, standing in that tiny square with its glowing fire and humble offerings, you finally understand why Demeter loved the quiet winter fields. Because winter teaches people how to care for one another softly, how to honor life even when it sleeps, how to keep warmth alive when the world grows cold, and how to trust that spring will come, because it always has. You remain near the communal hearth as evening deepens, letting the warmth sink into your bones. The fire burns low, glowing with the soft orange of embers that have settled into their most peaceful state. Villagers drift toward the flames like tired moths, slowly, quietly, carrying blankets, cups of tea, and the kind of winter calm that smooths out the sharp edges of life. A couple of older villagers settle onto wooden stools, both moving with the practiced grace of people who have told these stories many winters over. Children gather near their feet, forming an eager semicircle, wide-eyed, blanket-wrapped, already shushing each other as if the tales require total silence. You take a seat at the edge of the crowd, tugging your coat closer around you, The night is cold enough that your breath rises in little puffs of steam. One elder clears her throat softly and begins with the kind of gentle authority that only storytellers and grandmothers possess. Her voice flows out into the night, warm, smooth, slightly raspy around the edges like parchment worn from turning too many pages. She tells the story of Demeter wandering the earth in winter, lantern in hand, searching every valley and grove for hints of her daughter Persephone. A mainstream historical fact flickers through your thoughts. In many Greek communities, winter storytelling was a favored tradition because agricultural downtime left families gathered together indoors. These hearthside tales weren't just entertainment, they were reminders of why the world behaved the way it did. The children lean closer as she describes Demeter's soft footfalls across snowy fields, the goddess brushing frost from sleeping seeds to keep them safe until spring. You can almost picture it, Demeter kneeling over frozen soil with infinite patience, whispering quiet blessings into the earth. A man beside the fire jumps in with his own addition because of course he does, and claims that some villages believed Demeter used winter to judge which fields had been tended with love and which fields had been treated like chores. She can tell, he insists with a firm nod. Goddesses always know when you half-water the beans. Several villagers chuckle. You do too. It's strangely reassuring to imagine that even divine beings get annoyed at lazy gardening. As the fire crackles softly, the second storyteller, a tall, elderly man, with hair the exact color of fireplace ash, leans forward. He describes Persephone in the underworld, walking through shadowed halls lined with sleeping flowers. In his telling, Persephone spends the winter arranging petals, sorting seeds, and preparing new blossoms so they bloom perfectly when she returns to the surface. He paints the scene gently, turning the harshness of the underworld into something almost tender. But of course, the children want details. Is it scary down there? One asks, clutching her blanket tighter. Only if you leave your laundry unfolded, the elder says. Without missing a beat, the children giggle, and even a few adults snort quietly. Humor is its own kind of winter warmth. A fringe tidbit slips into your mind. Some rural Greek communities told softer, more domestic versions of the Persephone myth, not to downplay tragedy, but to help children understand the changing seasons without fear. In these stories, the underworld wasn't a place of terror. It was a place of rest, preparation, and quiet work. Winter became a cosmic nap, not a punishment. As the elder continues, he says that every winter night, Demeter pauses her wandering to listen, really listen for the faintest echoes of Persephone's laughter rising through the frozen soil. If the earth hums softly in response, she knows spring is inching closer. You sit there, soaking in the imagery. The night air feels a little less cold now. Another villager adds her own brief tale about how the winter wind once carried a message from Demeter to a lonely shepherd who had fallen asleep beside a dying fire. The shepherd dreamed of golden fields and woke to find that the wind had blown sparks into a warm little nest of embers, just enough to get his fire going again. Demeter doesn't like quitters, she says with a shrug. Even shepherds need a pep talk sometimes. The group laughs, and a child nearby whispers, "I like her." Same, kid. But as often happens in communal storytelling, the mood shifts again, softening, deepening when someone asks, "Why does Demeter love winter at all?" The elders exchange slow glances, each silently nominating the others to answer. Finally, the first storyteller lifts her chin and replies, "Because winter is when the world is honest." She explains that in spring, the earth bursts with showy growth. In summer, it swells with confidence. In autumn, it pretends not to be tired. But winter tells the truth. Winter shows the bones of the land, the shape of the hills, the strength of the trees. Winter reveals what survives, what rests, and what asks to be remembered. The villagers hum thoughtfully. You do too. Historians still argue whether these local winter myths were meant to comfort farmers or subtly encourage them to respect seasonal cycles. But watching how peacefully these stories settle into the minds of listeners young and old, you suspect the purpose was simpler. Humans need stories to explain stillness. The fire pops loudly, sending a tiny ember jumping onto the packed snow. A child squeaks, Everyone laughs again. As the storytelling continues, you notice that the tales blend into one another like threads in a winter blanket, each one soft, warm, and gently woven. Stories of Demeter brushing frost from grain, stories of Persephone humming lullabies to seeds, stories of the wind carrying prayers, stories of frozen rivers that whisper secret promises of thaw. You lean back slightly, letting the warmth of the fire and the hush of myth settle into your chest. The night sky above the village glows faintly with scattered stars, and the breath of every villager rises like a drifting offering to the quiet winter air. And in this circle of firelight, wrapped in tales that have softened countless winters, you feel something simple but profound. Winter isn't empty. Winter is listening, and Demeter listens with it. You step closer, and the priestess gestures for you to walk the inner path of the sanctuary. Even here, the hush feels thicker than the incense. Every footstep you take presses lightly into frost-dusted earth, as if the ground has been waiting all morning for someone to acknowledge its stillness. A mainstream historical fact rises naturally in your thoughts. Greek winter festivals for Demeter didn't disappear. When the cold arrived, many grew more introspective. The Haloa, the Thesmophoria, the midwinter observances, all of them shifted their tone, leaning into gentler gatherings, whispered rituals, offerings done in soft light rather than blazing torches. Winter Demeter wasn't gone. She was quieter, reserved, watching patiently until the world thawed. But a priest who tends the lamps tells you a quirky fringe belief. Some remote villages once claimed that Demeter only visited their shrines in winter because they were quiet. They believed she avoided loud, rowdy cities during the cold months and preferred humble altars where she could hear the heartbeat of the soil sleeping. No scholars fully endorse this idea, but they don't dismiss it either, and historians still argue whether these winter-exclusive traditions were older than the more famous autumn festivals. You pause at a stone table, where offerings have frozen lightly on their trays. Bread loaves crack gently at the edges. A small bowl of oil has stiffened to a pale golden sheet. A pomegranate, sliced open earlier, has tiny crystals forming along the exposed seeds. Everything looks like the altar has been tucked into a dream. The priestess motions to a stack of winter torches, shorter than the ones used in summer, wrapped in reeds rather than long cloth. The wind takes the tall ones too easily, she whispers. She lights one, and the flame glows low, barely more than a well-behaved ember. You hold it, and feel almost embarrassed by its softness. No dramatic roar, no heroic blaze, more like a candle held by a shy librarian. But the flame matches the season. Demeter's winter rituals weren't about spectacle. They were about presence, endurance, a promise whispered into the cold air. I am still here. As you follow the inner ring of the shrine, you notice people kneeling separately rather than in groups. Winter prayers are solitary, introspective. A farmer prays over a dormant plough, tracing its wooden frame with a finger as though reassuring an old friend. A mother holds a child bundled in thick wool, murmuring quiet thanks for surviving another season. An elderly woman kneels beside a basket of last year's barley, touching the grains with trembling reverence. Everything here breathes slow, steady patience, Demeter's winter virtue. You step into a smaller annex, where the air feels even colder. Thin sheets of ice lace the corners of the floor. A few worshippers sit cross-legged before a low slab containing carved images of seeds buried underground. The carvings are simple, almost childlike, yet powerful. They show what the world forgets. Beneath the surface, even in winter's silence, life prepares its return. One young girl, barely old enough to braid her hair, whispers to you that her grandmother told her, Demeter listens best when the earth is frozen. Because when everything stops moving above ground, the goddess can finally hear the tiny murmurs below, seeds shifting, soil settling, roots stretching like sleepers adjusting under blankets. Is that historically accurate? Hard to say, but it feels true in the moment. You move back outside, where the wind has softened to a gentle brush across your cheek. A priest ties a narrow ribbon of undyed wool around your wrist. A winter promise, he murmurs. Not for luck, just for patience. You nod, strangely grateful. There's something comforting about wearing a reminder that not everything needs to grow at once. Sometimes the world rests. Sometimes you rest. A bell chimes soft, uncertain, as if unsure whether anyone wants to hear it. Worshippers slowly rise from their prayers, adjusting cloaks, pulling hoods tighter, exchanging small nods instead of long conversations. No festival dancing today, no loud proclamations, just a shared understanding that the season asks for quiet. As you walk toward the gate, you notice a final detail: scattered footprints in the frost, leading beyond the shrine into the fields. You follow them, and soon you see why. Worshippers step out there to place tiny offerings, rare winter flowers, smooth stones, bits of grain directly onto the sleeping soil. It's a gesture of trust, a reminder to Demeter that the fields are still waiting for her warmth, and a reminder to themselves that winter is a pause, not an end. You kneel beside one small patch of earth, cold seeping through your clothes. You place a single grain between your fingers, hold it for a moment, then rest it gently on the frozen ground. The wind is almost silent. A bird calls faintly in the distance. Even the sky feels slower. And for a heartbeat, you understand something simple and beautiful. Winter isn't a punishment. It's an exhale, a season where the world stops talking long enough for Demeter to listen. You rise slowly, brushing frost from your knees. The shrine behind you glows faintly, its quiet warmth balanced perfectly against the winter air. And as you step back onto the path, the stillness follows you, settling softly across your shoulders like a shawl made of silence. You leave the quiet winter shrine behind you, following a narrow path that winds gently through Demeter's sleeping fields. Frost still clings to the edges of every furrow, sparkling faintly like crushed starlight. The air carries the crisp clarity that only late winter can hold, a kind of honesty, sharp and clean, as if the world has finally said everything it needed to say and now sits in comfortable silence. Your breath puffs in small white clouds as you walk, and for a moment you simply listen to the soft crunch of frost beneath your sandals. The goddess' presence lingers like a warm echo, subtle, not overwhelming, a reminder that rest is sacred too, and even divine work follows a seasonal rhythm. Just ahead, an elderly farmer adjusts the ties of his heavy cloak. He nods to you, then gestures toward the eastern horizon. "She's turning back," he murmurs. You look closer. The light really is different now, slightly brighter, slightly earlier, pushing just a sliver farther across the cold fields. It's the first whisper of winter, loosening its grip. A mainstream historical fact surfaces gently in your mind. In ancient Greek thought, Demeter's power was not constant. It expanded and softened with the seasons. Winter was her quietest phase, but the earliest signs of returning sunlight were viewed as her first cautious steps toward reawakening the land. These weren't dramatic myths. They were everyday truths that farmers relied on. You continue walking, feeling the change inside the air itself. It's still cold, still sharp, but something underneath the faintest warmth has begun to breathe. Ahead, a group of women stand in a field's corner, gathering dried stalks left from last season. They aren't harvesting. They're preparing the ground for the first spring rites. Their motions are slow, careful, almost meditative. They hum softly, no melody you recognize, more like the echo of a lullaby sung to the earth. One woman shows you a small clay bowl filled with ashes and soil. "For waking," she whispers. She scatters it lightly along the ridge of a furrow, letting the wind carry some of the dust farther than her hands could reach. You watch the particles dance, rising and falling like tiny flecks of forgotten sunlight. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some rural traditions once claimed Demeter tested the land each winter by sending faint breaths of warmth at dawn. If the soil released a certain scent, one that farmers described as the memory of grain, then she considered the earth ready to wake. Modern scholars shrug. Villagers swear it's real. You breathe deeply, half expecting to smell that mythical memory of grain. Instead, you smell cold air, distant firewood, and the faint sweetness of early morning. The fields open wider as you approach a long earthen embankment. Shadows stretch across its base, but a soft golden glow just begins to peek over its crest. You climb it slowly, boots sinking slightly into frozen dirt. At the top, the entire valley spreads beneath you. Fields, shrines, farmsteads, narrow roads curled like sleeping serpents. Winter still holds everything in a gentle grip, But the sky tells a different story. A thin band of peach-pink light breaks along the horizon. It isn't warm yet, but the intent is unmistakable. The return of light always begins before you can feel it. Villagers gather silently along the embankment, standing several paces apart. They don't speak. They simply watch the sky, waiting. This is not a festival. It's more intimate than ritual, more personal than ceremony. It's a moment when people acknowledge that the earth is beginning to turn back toward life. A soft breeze stirs the ends of your cloak, and you notice the tiniest bird, a winter sparrow perched on a fence post. It tilts its head, watching the same sunrise you are. Maybe even it knows what this light means. As the glow brightens, someone behind you whispers, "She's stirring." No fanfare, no hymns, just the quiet relief of people who have survived another season. A debate drifts into your thoughts, one scholars still argue over. Was Demeter's seasonal cycle originally tied to agricultural reality, or was the story shaped later to explain the rhythms farmers already observed? The truth is probably both. Myths grow from soil as much as belief. The sun finally edges above the horizon, sending long, pale shafts of light across the frost-covered fields. They glitter like the world has been dusted in powdered gold. You watch as the first slivers of warmth soften the frost, turning it into tiny droplets that cling to the stalks and stones. Around you, villagers begin placing their hands on the earth, palms down. You follow their gesture. The soil beneath your fingers is cold, but a little less cold than before, barely noticeable, but enough. You stay like that for a long breath, grounding yourself in the moment, letting the field's quiet strength settle into you. The return of light is never dramatic. It's never fast. It's never loud. But it always arrives. And Demeter always rises with it. One of the women whispers to you that the first warm wind of the season is called the goddess sigh. She smiles shyly, clearly aware of how poetic that sounds. But then she points to the horizon and adds, "Just wait. You'll know it when it comes." You start walking again, following the subtle glow stretching across the waking fields. Every step you take feels lighter, as though the cold is lifting grain by grain, and with each passing second, the world around you shifts quietly, delicately, toward the promise of spring. Demeter's winter silence is ending. Her footsteps are already returning to the soil, and you, walking beside the fields she loves, feel the world beginning to breathe again. You continue across the softening fields as winter loosens its hold, one quiet heartbeat at a time. The earliest warmth of returning sunlight lingers lightly on your face, faint and gentle, more promise than presence. The villagers drift back to their tasks, still keeping their voices low, as if they don't want to disturb the fragile moment when the world shifts from sleeping to waking. You walk toward a low hill at the edge of the valley, drawn by something you can't quite explain. Maybe it's the way the slope rises above the fields like a quiet lookout. Maybe it's the memory of hearing farmers talk about how Demeter sees her work from above when winter ends. Or maybe it's just that you want one last view of this season before it fades completely into myth. Your boots crunch softly over frost-thinned grass as you climb, the incline steady but kind. The air grows cooler again as you rise, touched by the last breath of winter's evening chill. A small trail winds upward, barely visible, except for the faint depressions left by generations of feet. You follow it, feeling the history settle gently around you. By the time you reach the top, dusk has begun to unfold its soft blanket across the sky. The horizon glows with lingering amber light, fading slowly into violet and blue. Far below, the valley is scattered with small glimmers, lamps being lit, hearth fires waking, windows glowing like stars fallen into the earth. You stand quietly, letting the view sink into you. This is Demeter's realm in winter. Not silence, not emptiness, but a deep, living pause. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your thoughts. The ancient Greeks viewed winter not as death, but as divine restraint. Demeter withdrawing her energy to protect the earth from overspending itself. Fields needed rest as much as people did. Crops grew better because the soil slept, recovered, breathed. This wasn't just mythology. It was early ecological wisdom, covered in poetic storytelling. You look over the fields again, seeing them with new eyes. The furrows that seemed barren a few hours ago now look like pages waiting for ink. The frost on their ridges glows faintly under the settling twilight, shimmering like the remnants of a goddess touch. A soft wind curls around you, cool, delicate, and strangely comforting. You think of the woman earlier who said the first warm wind of the year was the goddess sigh. If that's true, then maybe this cold one is the final exhale of winter, a closing line at the end of a season-long story. You sit on a small stone near the hilltop. It's smooth and slightly warm from the last of the evening sun. From here, you can see the entire valley. Fields, shrines, cottages, winding paths, olive groves sleeping under bare branches. You sense why Demeter might love this view. It's a world in between, resting yet alive, preparing yet peaceful. A quirky tidbit floats up from memory. Some ancient farmers believed that Demeter walked the fields invisibly during winter nights, checking each furrow for patience. If a farmer tended the land too early, ploughing before the soil had softened, Demeter would turn her face away, ensuring a poorer harvest. It wasn't punishment, it was a divine lesson in timing. You chuckle softly, imagining a goddess shaking her head at overeager farmers like a parent catching someone trying to open a gift too early. As dusk deepens, the sky shifts into shades of plum and indigo. Stars emerge slowly at first, then more confidently. Their pale glimmers match the tiny lights scattered through the valley, making the world above and below look like mirror images. You draw your cloak tighter, sinking deeper into the moment. You think about everything winter reveals. How quiet can be a teacher, how resting can be a form of strength, how stillness prepares the way for growth, and how, in Demeter's mythology, even grief reshaped the world's seasons. Far across the valley, a dog barks once, then settles. A family's laughter drifts faintly through the cold air. Somewhere closer, a lone owl calls out from the branches of a leafless fig tree. Life never really stops. It just softens. Scholars still argue whether Demeter's winter myths were rooted more in agriculture, psychology, or ritual tradition. But sitting here, watching the calm landscape breathe under the fading sky, you suspect the answer doesn't need to be neat. Winter always holds multiple truths. Myths simply wrap those truths in warmth. You rise slowly, giving the valley one last long look. The fields appear serene, wrapped in the final hush of the season. You understand now why Demeter loved them this way, quiet, waiting, full of potential. Winter wasn't a punishment, it was permission to pause. And in this gentle twilight, you feel that permission settling into you too. As you begin your descent, lanterns flicker to life along the distant roads. The world is shifting again, preparing for spring, for light, for renewal. Demeter's footsteps are already stirring beneath the soil. The goddess loved winter because it protected what mattered most. And walking down the hill, with night rising softly around you, you carry that understanding with you, calm, steady, and warm as the first seed of spring. The fields settle into a hush, and you let your breath fall into that same slow rhythm. The way winter air always seems to know exactly how to quiet the world. The last traces of Demeter's story drift gently around you, soft as loose snowflakes, and you feel the landscape exhale after everything it has carried. The hills, the bare branches, the cold earth waiting beneath the frost, they all stretch out in long, gentle lines, as if encouraging you to rest the same way they do. You walk a few more steps, though even walking feels slower now, like you're moving through a dream that's folding itself neatly at the edges. The winter field opens wide around you, a pale, calming expanse, and for a moment you can almost sense why Demeter loved it, why she favored these quiet months, why she leaned into stillness the way others leaned into sunlight. There's a strange comfort in knowing the world pauses on purpose, that the cold season isn't the end of anything, just a long, thoughtful breath before warmth returns. Your thoughts drift too, loosening, softening, settling wherever they want. The sky dims just a little more. The air cools just enough to quiet even your own heartbeat into a steady, even pulse. And you realize the story isn't asking anything of you anymore. It's not guiding, not teaching, not urging. It's simply keeping you company while everything else falls away. Let the last images fade, the goddess walking across snowy ground, the grain seeds hidden under frost, the earth resting because it has earned the right to be still. Let the quiet stretch. Let your breathing slow to match it. You are safe. You are warm. You can let go now.